Welcome to another tutorial on Fortigate Firewall. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can translate the IPv6 address to an IPv4 address. Basically, I mean to say, how can you communicate from a IPv6 domain to a IPv4 domain? Okay, since most of the regions have started migration from IPv4 to IPv6, so in the coming future we will always have this issue in your network. Okay, rest of some part of your network will be IPv6 and the rest of the network will be IPv4. So how you will ensure that the communication is seamless? So I'm going to show you how you can translate and how you can allow IPv6 domain to communicate to IPv4 domain. On the screen, you can see that there is a client, okay, which is a Linux machine in my case. For example, I mean, you can consider any client. In my case, just for the demonstration purpose, I've taken the Linux machine. Okay, it is having a IPv6 IP as you can see on screen, 2ABC:264. Okay, and the motive here is that since this client is IPv6 enabled, okay, it wants to communicate to google.com. Here I've taken the example of google.com. So you can take the example of any website which only supports IPv4. Okay, so the intention is to reach out to google.com, but then how? Because this is IPv6 based, but the website that you're trying to reach is IPv4. Again, I'm repeating myself. This is just a test that I've taken. It can be other website which is IPv4 based. Okay, there is no support for IPv6. So this particular scenario addresses those issues. So first thing is, when you want to communicate from the client, which is IPv6 based, to a server, which is IPv4 based. So first thing what happens is the client sends a DNS request, okay, to the IPv6 IP that you have configured or the DNS IP that you have configured. It receives the DNS response and then it initiates the original packet. Source IP is going to be the 2ABC. Destination IP is going to be the IPv6 IP of the website. Since in this case, it is google.com, which is our test website, which is not capable of IPv6. So we have to do something on the FortiGate firewall. So if you are using NAT64, then you should always have the DNS server. What it does, it takes this particular DNS query from the client, okay, and then forwards it to an external DNS server and then gets the reply. Okay, this is purely on the basis of IPv4. The answer that FortiGate gets from the system configured DNS is a IPv4 IP. Let's say it receives XYZ1. So this is the IPv4 IP. Okay, but the FortiGate cannot hand over this IPv4 IP to the client, right? So it has to proxy the response. So it receives the query from the Linux IPv6 client, and then once it is done resolving the actual IPv4 IP of the website, which is google.com, what it's going to do is it is going to change the response. Okay, this is a record. It is going to change it to AA record. And then it is going to send this answer to the Linux machine. And then Linux machine will initiate the traffic from the source IP to ABC. 2 and the destination IP. But how do FortiGate do that? Well, FortiGate uses a NAT64 prefix IPv6 IP, I guess. So it uses the first 96 bit of the IPv6 IP that you have configured on FortiGate, which is going to be something like 64FF9B. And the other part of the address, which is the rest of the 32-bit, is going to be the translated IP of that particular website. In our case, it is going to be XYZ1. I'm going to show you in some time in practical how it looks like and how it is calculated. So whenever you want to configure NAT64, make sure you have something in your network which is capable of doing this translation. I would suggest or recommend you to use FortiGate IP port 2 for such translation. Okay, you can configure the DNS server on port 2 so that FortiGate can translate this address from A record to AA record. They call it synthesizing. All right, so yeah, so this is the scenario, and there is no way where a client machine, can initiate the traffic IPv6 as a source IP and destination IP as IPv4. No, it is not going to happen. So this is the reason why we need something in the middle of your communication which can do the translation from A record to AA record. Okay, this is very important. And how do FortiGate create this AA record? Well, I have already explained. It uses the first 96 bit from the NAT64 prefix, which will look something like 64FF9B, and rest of the part is going to be the translated IPv4 IP. XYZ1, you will have to translate it to hex format, and then it will create this entry, and then it will update the client that, you know what, the IPv6 IP corresponding to google.com is this. Now you can initiate the traffic, which will again go to the Fortigate firewall, and we will have the NAT64 policy configured to allow the traffic and again to do the translation from the IPv6 to IPv4. Okay, so once DNS query is done, so the client knows, let me rub it off. So we have reached the stage where the client is having the AA record. So now it can initiate the traffic. So the packet, original packet, will look something like this, right? And the destination is going to be the IP address provided by the Fortigate firewall, which in our case, it will look like 64FF9B. And rest of the 32-bit, you will have to convert it based on the translation. So this packet moves to the Fortigate firewall. Okay, we have already completed one uh, step of the communication, which is the DNS resolution, which converts the A record to AAA record and sends it back to the client. Now the second phase of communication is initiating the actual packet. It comes to the Fortigate firewall, hits the NAT policy, NAT64, we call it, or most of the firewall vendor call it as NAT64, which changes this packet, okay, and it changes the source IP from this to this external IP, and destination, since it has already maintained the table, it is going to use the A record IP and then sends the packet to the google.com, receives the reply, do the same thing, send it back to the same destination IP using the same source, which is this one. Okay, so this is the theory part of the scenario. So now let's move on to the actual demonstration. As you can see on my screen, this is the CentOS machine, okay, which is having the IP address as mentioned on the diagram that I showed you in the beginning, 2ABC 264. And it is connected to, okay, this is the Fortigate Firewall. You can see here. For those of you who don't know how to configure the IPv6 IP on CentOS, well, what you can do is you can go to the CentOS machine. And then on top, you will see this logo, which is the Ethernet option. Get inside, enable this, get inside, disable the IPv4, go to IPv6, keep it manual, put the IP address, prefix, gateway, and then update the DNS, apply. That's it, done, you're done. So another thing that you can verify is that whether you have the proper resolver IP or not. Okay, as you can see, the DNS IP is set to the Fortigate Firewall's IP. You can see here. This is the IP or the port on which the DNS service is running. So I have configured here the DNS as the IP address on port 2. Okay, so I'll show you that I was talking about the translation. Okay, dig. Okay, this is going to be for the IPv6 translation. Okay, I'm going to use this IP to check if my translation is happening properly or not. As you can see, it is giving me this particular IPv6 IP for google.com. Okay, like I said, there is a default NAT64 prefix, and the way they have calculated this IP is by 64FF9B, and rest of the 32-bit part is going to be the translation, actual translation IP, translated IP. So I'll show you the calculation in some time. let me see if I can get hold of that information. Okay, so I have initiated a ping towards google.com from the client one so that I can show you how the IP address is calculated. So as you can see that my google.com is translated to 64ff9b, which is exactly what we have read here. Okay, 64ff9b, and rest of the chunk, which is 32-bit, is going to be the translated IP. Let's check that out. So this is the rest of the chunk. Let's try to figure out what does this corresponds to. So I have taken the information from the session. As you can see here, this is the 96-bit, and rest of the 32-bit is going to be this, which translates to 216.58.220.110, which is the Google IP. All right. So this is how they calculate the IPv6 when the FortiGate is doing the proxy. See here, this is the NAT64 default prefix, and this is the translated IP, which corresponds to 216.58.220.110. So this is how they calculate the IP address while doing the DNS proxy or synthesizing the DNS packet. Okay, so let's go and check the steps on how you can configure this. So the first thing is you configure the IPv6 address on ETH1 interface of client. Like I said, if you want to do so, then you will have to get into the client machine and then do the configuration accordingly. And then you can cross check your DNS resolver IP as well, like I showed you previously. Not sure if this is captured. Here I have showed you. This is the first thing that you should be doing once you configure the IP address. So let's move on to the FortiGate firewall. So I can show you the configuration here as well. So this is the system DNS. By default, it is configured with this IP. So it will reach out to this particular IPs for the google.com resolution. Okay, so this is the configuration that I was talking about, DNS. Okay, before that, let me show you how it looks like on the GUI. By the way, you can refer this documentation. I'll put this in the description. So this is the FortiGate firewall. Okay, you will have to go to the system feature visibility. Okay, to enable this. First of all, let's see the point. This is done. Next point is going to be update the DNS IP, which is also done. Feature visibility. Okay, now we are at feature visibility. Now let's check out what are the features that you will have to enable it. You will have to enable this. Okay, and this is the 7.0 version, which is the latest one as of now. You have to enable this. you will have to enable this particular option, DNS database, and then you have to enable NAT64 46. Okay, three options you will have to enable it. Okay, now we are done with third part. So let's move on to the fourth one, which is the IPv6 addresses on port 2 of firewall. Let's see. So this is the port 2. It is already configured with the IP address to ABC 64. Like I said, you can see here to ABC colon colon 164. Okay, and I've enabled the ping as well. So now our fourth point is also completed. Let's move on to the fifth one, which is configuring the IP address on the port 1 of FortiGate Firewall. You can see here it is already configured. I'm getting a DHCP IP directly from my edge router. Okay, now let's move on to the next option. What we have to do, configure the DNS server on port 2 of the FortiGate firewall. So which is very important. So you will not see this option unless and until you go to the feature visibility and click on DNS database. Since I have already enabled it, so I can see the option, and you can click on create and then select the port. In my case, it is going to be the port 2. Okay, and you have to select this option, forward to system DNS. Okay, so that the system uses the configured DNS to get the resolution for the external IPv4 websites. As you can see here, I have already configured the DNS server on port 2, forward to DNS, system DNS. All right, so that also looks good. And post this, you can do the verification on your client. No matter if it is your Linux client or Windows client, doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is the resolution, that you should be getting a proper resolution once you're done with the configuration. So how can you check that? You can check that by doing this. Okay, I'm getting a proper IPv6 resolution, and the starting of the IPv6 IP is going to be 64FF9B. Okay, you can verify this step before moving on to the next step. So our configuration is also good. So now let's move on to the configuration of policy, which is NAT64 policy. Okay, so under the section policy and objects, you will see the NAT64 policy here. Since I have already created it, I'm going to show you the one that is already there, but you can create a new one. It is pretty simple. I've given the name as NAT64, selected the port on which I will receive the traffic, which is port 2. Port 1 is going to be my outgoing interface. You can selectively have the addresses that are allowed. And here I have, okay, let's try to do it with the outgoing interface IP. Okay, first, and then I'll try to show you the dynamic IP pool as well. Click OK. That's it. You're done. Done with this configuration. Okay, now we are seeing the translation with outgoing interface IP, which is 192.168. This IP. Okay. After this, I'm going to show you how you can use pool there. So now we are almost done. Let's try to ping. So this is the option to ping. ETH1 is the IP, is the interface on which my IPv6 IP is configured. Okay. So once I do that, I should see, you can see here the translation, DC 6E. And the same thing you can see here as well. Okay, you can see here, this is the DNS query that is coming in, purely IPv6. And the actual DNS will be in IPv4 that the FortiGate forwards to the external DNS and gets the A record. And this is the translated A record to AA record. Let's try to filter this. So you can see here, this is the session. So the original packet, you can see here to ABC colon 2, which is our source, to ABC colon 2. Destination is going to be the one that Fortigate generate for the client during the DNS lookup. Let's see that. You can see here. So it starts with 64FF9B. Rest of the thing is the IP address, this one. Okay, which translates to 32-bit. Let's see if there is any source translation. Yeah, there is source translation as well. So this was with the help of the outgoing interface IP as source once it leaves the FortiGate firewall. So you can clearly see here our source is getting translated to this IP, which is our outgoing interface IP. This one. Destination is google.com, which is translated to this IPv6 IP by the firewall. So the actual packet that leaves towards the internet is this. Then the reply comes back to this IP, and then the FortiGate is already maintaining the translation table. So it translates this IP and port, and then it sends it to this. So pretty much all about the configuration. Now let me show you how you can change. Okay, by the way, this is the pool that I've created. This is again the same IP address. So if you have a block of IPs, you can specify that. But here I don't have any. So I'm going with the 113, which is the interface IP. Okay, just a demonstration. You can have a block mentioned here. Then go to the IPv6, IP64 policy, edit, use dynamic pool. This is the pool that we have just created. Click OK. Now let's test it out. Okay, pretty much about this. And another thing that you can verify is this. I mean, if you want to verify the address, you can copy this and you can see here, I'm able to translate this particular address, which is the Google address, to the corresponding 32-bit hex. So you can make use of online tool to convert your IP address to hex format. This is the 32-bit chunk that I was talking about. All right, I guess I have covered all the configuration, all the basics that you required for IPv6 to IPv4 translation, which is basically NAT64, and the DNS configuration so that you have the proper record A to AA record translation. All right, guys, that's all in this video, and please do subscribe to my channel. Hit the like button. If you have any questions, do leave them in the comment section. Have a good day.